So welcome everybody at this webinar. So I will talk a little bit about dealing with uncertainty from cost estimates to geopolitics, but you may want to recognize that this is in the context of investment decisions and strategy development. So that is the context in which you have to put this presentation. So the agenda is, we already talked about EDPN. But I will cover a number of topics: uncertainty and risk, probabilistic analysis, risk management, the use of scenarios, and some concluding remarks. And bear in mind, this is a very high-level overview. I will not go in a lot of detail. First of all, I'm not sure who has attended the first webinar in this series in May, which was about decision quality. But first of all, I would like to remind you of the 6 decision quality principles. You need to frame your decision problem adequately. You need to look at multiple alternatives, gather credible information, apply logical reasoning, make very transparent trade-offs, and then in the end have a clear commitment to action. Those are the 6 decision quality principles that are used by many companies to sort of assess the quality of their decision making. Now, that decision making is obviously fairly straightforward if you do not have uncertainties. Then you can just calculate and it's clear what comes out, and you can proceed and make a decision and get into action. But obviously uncertainties make that a much more involved and complex process than it would be otherwise. So the uncertainty dimension comes in through when you do the framing. You need to assess what are the uncertainties. Obviously there's uncertainty in the data that you use, the information that you're using, and there is uncertainty in the models that you're applying. How valid are the models that you use to process your data and to come and calculate the decision metrics. So that is the context in which you should see this presentation about uncertainties. So what do I mean with uncertainty? And mind you, there are quite a few different definitions and different ways people use that, and I don't want to argue with that, but I just want to make sure that you're familiar with what I mean with uncertainty and risk. Uncertainty in my book is a variable or phenomenon which has multiple possible outcomes. And with risk in particular, risk has sometimes different meanings, but what I mean, and keep that in mind, is the exposure to a perceived unfavorable outcome. But again, there can be other interpretations as well. So sometimes you see risk as a synonym for volatility, or what they actually mean is standard deviation, or perhaps some event, some risk event they talk about. But this is not what I mean. I mean the exposure to an unfavorable outcome. So probabilistic analysis, understanding the impact of uncertainty. As I said, in the information, in the data that you use to do an evaluation, you need to understand how that uncertainty will in the end affect your decision metrics. So the parameters that you use to base decisions on, and in normal investment decisions, that would be profitability parameters, value parameters, costs, and obviously there can also be other decision criteria that you want to use, but in this presentation we will focus largely on the financial criteria. In order to get a sense of how uncertainty in the input parameters affect your decision metrics, you can make plots. You can for example, a sensitivity plot, a spider diagram, is often used to understand how uncertainties in inputs affect the outputs. For example, in this particular graph, the blue line represent a variable that has a particularly larger impact on the output than the other lines, than the other variables. An often used tool is also the tornado diagram, where the length of the bars indicate the impact of a particular uncertainty range in an input, a price, a cost, or tax situation on the decision metrics, for example, the net present value. And a tornadogram should have the property that it is set using particular percentile values in the inputs, so certain ranges that are quantified using probability distributions. Then what probabilistics involves is taking the uncertainty ranges in the inputs, and through, we have a black box here, but obviously it should not be a black box to the analyst, but through some model generate the uncertainty ranges in the outputs. So that's the probabilistic approach. So the output, the decision metrics, are not single numbers, but they are ranges, probability distributions that allow a proper interpretation. There are various ways to do such probability analysis. You can do Monte Carlo simulation. Decision trees are in fact a probabilistic approach, but there are also easier methods like generating uncertainty ranges in decision matrix directly from the tornado using various techniques is a possibility. So the message here is that there are a range of different ways to actually skin this cat, and it depends a little bit on the decision problem and the type of model that you have, what method you use. But it can be a very complex Monte Carlo simulation, but it can also be a very straightforward approach from using the tornado and just converting that into a probability distribution of the NPV, for example. So in many companies, apart from the valuation activities, there is also a discipline called risk management. And the question is how, and often risk management activities are somewhat done on their own, and there's not a lot of integration with the process I just described. So what do we mean by risk management? It's really about having a structured way of assessing the risks that are potentially associated with a particular opportunity or a particular strategy, having a way to identify them, characterize them, group them, and so on, and then roughly assess the impact and likelihood of those risks, and then have a discussion what you want to do with them. Can you terminate those risks, so completely eliminate them? Or can you transfer them, for example, by an insurance, or treat them, deal with them in some other way, or come to the conclusion that you just simply have to take the risk, and you cannot do much about it, but you just have to take it. And that is then what is called residual risk, although that term gives the impression that it's maybe a minor remaining element, but obviously from a risk management exercise you can be left with quite substantial risks, and you need to do something with that, not just in terms of managing, but also in terms of incorporating them in the evaluation. So in this diagram on the top part you see the process of getting to a probabilistic assessment, but in parallel you also want to use the risk management data, the identification, assessment of what are the risks, and the process of risk quantification, and then incorporate that in the probabilistic assessment before you present it to decision makers. So how do you do that? Again, very high level. Untangle the risks in cause, risk event, and the range of impacts, and then have a set of evidence-based techniques to use expert judgment, to use historic data as well, in order to come to probabilities and ranges of the possibility that some risk event might happen and that it might have certain impacts on the variables that matter for the valuation of an opportunity, like volumes, price, cost, time, and tax. So you need probability and range assessments within the context of the risk management and feed that into the probabilistic analysis. Yet, despite even if you do all that, you may still have issues, uncertainties that are difficult to capture in this way. Often these are exogenous uncertainties, things like politics, regulation issues, macroeconomic issues, and so on. And then the use of scenarios can be helpful. So not all these risks and uncertainties can be captured in probability distributions, and if you cannot do that, you should not do it. But you can use scenarios to try to deal with those. So what are scenarios? Scenarios of the business environment. Also, the term scenario has often multiple meanings. They're used in different ways. But basically what we mean is plausible narratives spanning the uncertainty range, internally consistent narratives, and often you don't have more than 4 of those type of scenarios, otherwise it gets unwieldy. And so you need to define a geographic area, a set of themes, and a time horizon in order to sort of define the scope of your scenario effort, and then sort of bring together the factors that are relevant for your business, and help you to understand what the possible futures can be. So they're not forecasts, they're not precise, they're not static. They're sometimes called memories of the future. So it's about rehearsing the future in certain ways, in order to, when the time comes, you're better equipped to deal with situations that might occur. The essence of the scenario method is you have a number of uncertainties with multiple possible outcomes, and then to string together the outcomes in a way that makes sense. So it's a bit of a heuristic approach. You correlate, quote unquote, so not in a quantitative sense but in a qualitative sense, the various outcomes of uncertainty, and you group those together in a logical sequence. For example, a low oil price will mean problems in Venezuela, or a low oil price will mean a low exchange rate in Canada. So those are correlations that you can make, also sometimes using data, but sometimes also just using logic, that you can incorporate in the scenario build-up. So some examples of scenario projects are, the famous one is the scenarios that were made after the abolition of the apartheid in South Africa, but also countries will continue to have scenarios to guide their policy making. And obviously a well-known example is Shell, that has had scenarios for 40 years, and the last set of scenarios was published in 2013. They're called the New Land scenarios, and I personally participated in that myself. Scenario development methods. There are different ways to do this. There's a deductive approach, so where you have the classic 2x2 matrix with the 2 key uncertainties, and each uncertainty has 2 outcomes, and you group them together. But there's also the inductive approach, which is a more intuitive way to grouping uncertainty outcomes, and an incremental approach, which is using a base scenario, let's say the official future, and then vary that using incremental changes to that scenario. So let's take a look at, I could have taken the, let's say, 2013 scenarios as an example. and discuss those briefly. But let's take some scenarios that were made in 1992, so more than 25 years ago, in Shell. And they were scenarios that spanned the period up to 2020, so we're almost there. So let's see what they said, and let's compare that to what actually happened. And in those days, the early 90s, the key issue that was playing a role in political developments and so on in economies is liberalization. And it was recognized at that time that there can be two types of responses. Individuals, nations, companies can seize the opportunities, but it can also lead to a backlash, to protectionism, issues around cultural identity, and so on, and it can create resistance. So that notion was the basis of the two scenarios that were made at that time. So if you look at those scenarios, one was New Frontiers, which is very optimistic, high economic growth, a lot of collaboration, and in particular a lot of growth in emerging markets that would outstrip, let's say, the OECD world, the advanced economies. The other scenario was barricades, where there was a resistance against liberalization, countries having their own brand of capitalism, and where trade agreements would not be multilateral but very bilateral. So New Frontiers is cooperative to global problems, and so on. Barricades, multipolar political spectrum. And so not just the left-right spectrum, but also the, let's say, inclusive and exclusive spectrum. So nationalist parties would come up, it said, and so on. Tensions in the Middle East, volatile oil prices. And in the context of such scenarios, also some quantification is being done. For example, you see the diagram on the left, where an attempt was made at that time to sort of have macroeconomic numbers. So what would be the total world GNP, and how would that be distributed across countries, OECD countries, non-OECD countries in this case. So the question is, okay, so what has happened in reality? And obviously you will note that reality has elements of both scenarios. The actual economic distribution is somewhere in the middle between those two bars. And you will find that all of these things that are on these slides have actually happened. So the message is that scenarios will generally have elements of what actually will happen, or could have elements of what actually will happen. There's not a single scenario that is the, let's say, true scenario. But now, how do you make decisions on the basis of scenarios? And then you need to think about the difference between exploratory scenarios, so that are, let's say, looking broad at a certain set of issues in the world, and very focused scenarios that are really zooming in on a particular opportunity or a particular country, a particular strategy that you want to follow. And the exploratory scenarios are, the purpose of them is more to sort of have a framework for discussion about the future and how that could pan out. But then the focus scenarios are more aimed at a very specific opportunity, and then you will want to relate all the driving forces and all the uncertainties, which are these orange blobs, to quantitative numbers like volumes, price, cost, tax, and schedule, and calculate the impact on the decision metrics. If you do that for a particular project, you want to sort of relate that back to these very broad exploratory scenarios, of which you just saw an example in the 1992 example. But you need to make those connections between these broad, wide-ranging scenarios and the specific scenarios for a particular opportunity in some systematic way. And if you have done that, you can at least try, and it will not be perfect, it will not be very precise. For each scenario that is relevant for your opportunity, understand what roughly the decision-metric ranges will be. Again, that should be done probabilistically, so it's not a single number, but you should take into account the uncertainties that you have assumed in all your assumptions, and then calculate a net present value range or profitability range that is valid for particular scenarios. So, summarizing the scenario part, it's an attempt to better understand the partly intangible exogenous uncertainties, politics, regulation, and so on. It is about understanding how things hang together. All scenarios will yield insight. It's not a single scenario that comes true, or that is the right one. But where possible, when you make investment decisions, and you have these probabilistics, you have dealt with the risks using your risk management approaches, you still need to try to make the link with the decision metrics in the context of those scenarios. At the same time, you will still always need the probabilistic modeling, risk management, and in particular also the intuition and experience of the decision makers. So, to summarize, business decisions are often taken within the context of an uncertain and complex environment. Yeah? And probabilistic evaluation of decision metrics should be the preferred approach. It provides a more holistic understanding of the uncertainties. But in particular, and that is actually quite important, it also promotes careful considerations of the uncertainties and risks. There's obviously some value, or there's value in the output, in the results, but in particular also the process of getting to that result makes that you understand the uncertainties and risks much better. Risk management should not be a standalone activity, but to the extent relevant, of course, be integrated in the probabilistic evaluation. On top of that, and this is not for every simple opportunity, obviously, but for the bigger calls, for the bigger bets, for strategies, for billion-dollar projects, you may want to look at the scenario method to understand in what context you are making that investment decision. And in that process, it is best to link that to the decision metrics that you use in your business decisions, and which means that you will need to do some selective quantification within the context of those scenarios. So that was my very